Hi everyone. I'm making this video to talk about a topic that's very challenging, but I think it's a very important topic to bring out into the light, and that is the unconscionably high rate of suicide among veterinary professionals. Now, some of you may have noticed this Facebook frame that has popped up today with NOMV, the letters NOMV on it. And what that stands for is Not One More Vet, which is an online awareness campaign about suicide in a veterinary professional. And NOMV, just like another online project called the Riptide Project, are both awareness campaigns to shine a light on the very high rate of suicide among veterinarians. Now, what most people probably don't know is that the veterinary profession has the highest rate of suicide of any medical profession, or in fact, veterinarians are significantly more likely to commit suicide than baseline population in almost every country. I think in North America, sometimes we compete for this dubious honor with dentists, but it's definitely a contest in which you don't want to be a winner. In my opinion, there are two general groups of factors that contribute to this unfortunate statistic. One is some of the realities of what it means to work as a veterinarian, and the other one is how we select and train veterinarians, which unfortunately, in my opinion, often sets up well-meaning young people into a very difficult career path without really the tools to deal with the stressors that they will encounter on that career path. So let's talk first about the stressors in a veterinarian's life. I know that among human physicians, oncologists are considered as having one of the hardest specialties, because when you're an oncologist, almost all of your patients die. In most medical fields, death is something to be avoided, or it is something that is the result of a negative outcome. Whereas in a field like oncology, death is the expected outcome, and you're really there to make it a little bit easier, delay it, sometimes prevent it. But that is considered to be very, very challenging among physicians. Now, with veterinarians, all of your patients die. Most of our patients live from like 3 to maybe 20 years, depending on what species you're dealing with. And death is an integral part of veterinary practice. And more importantly, we do euthanasia. We don't let our patients die from natural causes. Now, euthanasia literally means a good death, and it's an integral part of a veterinarian's work, is to ease the passing out of life of our patients. So we're deeply involved with death, loss, and the grieving process that the pet owners experience around this. There have been several studies that demonstrate that the feelings of loss that humans feel around the death of a pet is no different than that they feel around the loss of a human relative, and in some cases even more acute. So as a veterinarian, you spend a lot of time working with grief counseling, providing grief counseling to people, dealing with end-of-life issues, being faced with your own mortality while you do this. And we have absolutely no training in this. Veterinarians aren't trained counselors. We're barely trained animal doctors. And yet we're expected, like as an absolutely integral part of our profession, to counsel people through end-of-life issues, through grief, loss. We really spend a lot of time working as psychologists without really any serious training or support in this field. Taking the parallel between veterinary medicine and human medical professions a little bit further, human medical professionals have a huge amount of support in what they do. There are well-developed support networks to help first-line responders, paramedics, nurses, as well as doctors deal with issues of loss, grief, dealing with confrontations with their own mortality, and just the fact anytime that first responders are exposed to death, they also have access to resources for dealing with stress, anxiety, bereavement. Healthcare professionals have active and dedicated support networks, whereas veterinarians have absolutely none of that. Not only do we not have any training to deal with the fact that, aside from managing cat kidney disease, we also have to do grief counseling for when the cat passes away, but there's also no support network for veterinarians to deal with the stresses in their life and the incredibly difficult psychological problems they deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now, again, things like the Riptide Project, like the NOMV project. They're attempting to create some sort of a network of support for veterinary professionals and also animal health technicians, so that to help them deal with these realities. But again, these are small projects and their outreach is still fairly limited within the profession. So vets have to work with all of these really heavy topics without any of the support that exists in the human side, in the human medical professions that have to deal with similar issues of death and loss and grief. This is a rather heavy and intense part of a veterinarian's daily life that most people don't realize. This is a part of veterinary profession that most people don't see. Like most medical professionals, we try to protect our family and our friends from the realities of some of the harsher realities of our job. And I think there's every veterinarian out there. There are days when they come home from work, they say hi to their family, they might hang out with their friends, and they may have spent 2 hours that day in a room full of crying people trying to help them deal with intense feelings of loss. And you'll never know, because this, as professionals, I think there's a generalized kind of belief that this is something that we have to bear, and we know that this is a difficult burden, and we don't wish to share it with our friends and our family, because quite frankly, this is not something most people can deal with unless they're prepared for it. It's not something we can deal with. We just figure out, you just develop coping skills because you're a fairly capable person if you've made it into veterinary profession. But we protect the people around us from these realities. Unfortunately, this definitely carries a long-term cost for the veterinarian. In addition to dealing with death a lot more than the average medical professional, veterinarians also have to deal with a number of stressors that human medical professionals simply do not. And what I'm talking about here, of course, is financial stress. Now, with exception to our friends in the United States, most countries that I mentioned, Canada, UK, Australia, have socialized medicine. People don't realize, people are used to getting medicine for free. They get medical treatment without paying anything for it. And even in the US, most people have health insurance, so they don't actually have to pay up front, although I think Americans are far more aware of costs of healthcare than people who live in other countries. But what we have to face quite often is this idea that veterinarians charge a lot of money, that we're greedy, that we're just in it for the money. And this is an idea that comes partially from the fact that people just have no idea how expensive it is to provide even a rudimentary level of medical care. Partially, I think, is that people who feel guilty or frustrated that they cannot take care of their pet or cannot follow through with the recommendations their veterinarian makes, they redirect their anger and frustration into anger at the veterinarian somehow, because it's much easier to be angry at somebody else for doing something wrong than to admit that you yourself don't have the resources or the abilities to provide what your loved ones, and pets are our loved ones, what your loved ones need. So veterinarians are often the target of this redirected, channeled anger and frustration that we all have to deal with. And I could make a multi-hour lecture on client interactions and the stresses inherent in them. But I think on a most fundamental level, we just have to recognize the fact that veterinarians catch a lot of shit. I hope by now you guys are getting a slightly more realistic vision of what the veterinary profession is and what it's like to be a veterinarian. You're dealing with death all the time, and a lot of really heavy emotional trauma that you're helping other people work their way through. You're basically working as a counselor. At the same time, you are very vulnerable to people's criticism and negative opinions, and your livelihood depends on people liking you, as well as your own psychological and emotional welfare depends on this, because it's the only way you can perform your duty to the animals and do your job. And then you can there's a bunch of other stresses you can pile on. Again, I don't want to go too much into them, but there's financial stressors, because while nobody goes to veterinary medicine for the money, veterinary medicine has the lowest return on investment of any profession. Your veterinarian might well be trying to pay off a $250,000 student loan, making $80,000 a year, which is a terrible idea. Some vets have trust funds, most of us don't. And those of us that do not, in fact, I'd say there's probably more poor people that go into veterinary medicine than wealthy people, because children of wealthy families know better. While your veterinarian may not have gone into the profession to make money, they may well be under intense financial stress. And if they're not struggling to pay off student loans, then they may be a clinic owner trying to make a business work. And again, veterinary practices as a business have some of the lowest margins of any viable small business there is, which is, and running a small business is stressful enough as it is. And if you combine on top of that having to practice veterinary medicine, we can really see why a lot of people get into some pretty serious psychological trouble trying to do this. And then on top of that, there's an element of personal danger, given that vets can and do occasionally get seriously injured in the course of our work, often career-ending or career-changing injuries. Add to that the sense of personal responsibility for your patients and clients, the fact that if your surgeon is operating on your grandma and he kills her, it's not going to be any negative personal outcomes to him. Stuff happens. 90-year-old patient, multiple morbidities. They're not going to survive the surgery every time. They don't miss a paycheck. They don't miss any sleep. And they have a huge support network to help them work through any feelings of personal guilt they may have. Compare that to a veterinarian who's trying to save a decrepit old animal who is at the end of their life, whose owners maybe presented them far too late in the disease process, turning a simple, easy to fix problem into a really expensive and difficult to fix problem. And if that patient doesn't do well, then the veterinarian has to lose his income quite often because people get cagey about paying for surgery that say didn't go well. They're often the focus of a lot of verbal abuse, threats, legal action. There's a ton of personal repercussions. So on top of already being a perfectionist, which again, most people who get into vet school are going to be, they also literally have to be perfect in the execution of their duties, because anytime you're not perfect, there's massive personal, emotional, financial repercussions to you, which is insane. Again, no other profession has to deal with personal repercussions on the same level as veterinarians, particularly not when dealing with such complex and multifactorial problems. So all of this creates a huge amount of stress that some people just can't handle. And I'm very lucky in that throughout my life I've developed very good coping mechanisms and that I'm very emotionally resilient. So for all those of you that are wondering, I'm doing all right. But there were definitely days in my career where the only way I could come to work was to bring Mr. Pirate with me and have him sitting in my office so I can come in and pet him between consults. Sometimes that's the only way I could get through the day. And luckily I haven't had one of those days in a few years, and those days were few and far between. But there's no veterinarian out there that hasn't had a really tough time at work. And I'm talking about things that are way outside what would be considered acceptable in any normal workplace, in any normal profession. And then let's not forget about the other part of the problem, the way we select veterinarians. And the veterinary education system is deeply problematic in my opinion. And I could make a whole series of videos about the problems with the way veterinarians are selected and trained. But just to give you guys an overview, the veterinary education system as it exists today selects for people who are eminently unsuitable to the stresses of the profession. Who gets into vet school? People who are highly conscientious, very academically gifted, very strong in the sciences, basically nerds. Nerds get into vet school, people who study very hard. Vet school is more challenging academically to get into than any other profession in most countries. And so these are people who are very academically gifted, but also choose to go into a really low paid profession, the lowest paid by like a factor of 3 to 10 of any medical profession. People who could have become a lawyer, could have gotten an MBA, could have become a physician, but instead choose to become a veterinarian and make like $80,000 out of school instead of $300,000, and who are essentially academically gifted, very emotional, because this is clearly an emotional decision, highly empathetic, because there's really no other reason to be a veterinarian other than a deep feeling of empathy towards animals. And you take all these people, you give them a very inadequate level of training. Again, this is something that could serve as a topic for a video on its own, but let's say you do 4 years of veterinary school. We know that 90% of vet school graduates in the last 2 decades, 90% of vet school graduates are going to go into small animal medicine. But only 60% of vet school is small animal medicine, 40% being still focused on production animals like pigs, cows, horses. So out of 4 years of vet school, you spend about 2.5 years actually learning anything useful to your profession. And then you're kicked out into the world. You get your little graduation hat and a diploma, and people call you doctor, and you're expected to perform the job of like 27 different medical specialties without any advanced training, without a residency or internship, and with really kind of 2.5 years of proper medical school. That's a pretty high expectation to live up to. And you often hear veterinarians talking about imposter syndrome. I think this is common to many professions. But I would argue that in the case of veterinarians, we don't suffer from imposter syndrome. We are actually imposters, at least when we graduate. We are in no way, shape, or form prepared to perform the job that society expects of us, that we expect of ourselves, and that we tell clients that we are capable of performing. Unfortunately, this selection process results in people who often are not going to be happy as a veterinarian, working in general practice, dealing with day-to-day minutiae of managing cases and people. Of all the veterinarians I've known, I would say the happiest, most satisfied with life vets are men who are kind of middle-aged, often really kind of easygoing guys who just love people, love talking to people, really extroverted, maybe don't care that much about the animals, to be quite honest with you, or they like animals, but it's not top priority. Aren't really performance oriented. They're not the best doctors. They're not super anal about stuff, but they do their best, and they just have a pretty good time in the profession. They still have rough days, but they get by. These are the people that I've met who are actually happy as vets. And this is nothing like what I just described in terms of who's selected to become a veterinarian. There really are anomalies. And I think this just outlines a serious issue in the way we select people into the profession, because it shouldn't be the case that people who are happy in the profession are the kind of person you kind of select against when you're trying to get into the vet school. So it's not your typical vet who I expect to be happy in the profession. And this is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed at the vet school level, rather than after you've graduated a bunch of people and said, here, deal with this life. I think it takes 4 to 5 years of intensive personal development for a veterinarian to become a really competent clinician. And not everybody puts that time in, not everybody indulges in that. But this creates a lot of really intense psychological pressures, as well as academic pressures on these individuals who were selected basically for being emotional and really clever. And then you put them into an environment I just described, where all of a sudden you have to deal with people, you have to be a salesperson, you have to be a grief counselor. So yeah, a lot of people can't handle it. And unfortunately, some of those people commit suicide. And unlike other individuals, vets are really good at killing things. We're a veterinarian. If there's nothing else a veterinarian can do, a veterinarian can kill anything from a hamster to an elephant. And they can do so effectively, quickly, and with a 100% success rate. So while other people might attempt suicide, and that might be a cry for help for them, if a veterinarian decides to commit suicide, they're going to succeed. And I have no doubt that that contributes greatly to the high suicide rate in our profession. And we don't miss. That's really tragic. It's tragic, and I'd like to think it's preventable. Although there's no easy, simple solution to this problem, because it is so deeply ingrained in the fundamental mechanics of our profession. So what can you do as a member of the public, as a pet owner, or somebody watching this video? Well, you can certainly go to the Riptide Project and the NOMV Project and donate to their good work in preventing suicide among veterinary professionals. Money certainly helps, although it certainly is not a solution to all problems. But perhaps more importantly, you can be nice to your veterinarian and do what they tell you to. honestly, all we really want as professionals is for clients to let us help their pets. And those clients that follow my instructions, pay their bills, come to their checkup appointments, and follow through with my recommendations are absolute gold. They put a smile on my face. They make me so happy. And again, I think this is true for every veterinarian out there. I think it's really good to raise community awareness about this problem. I think it's really important for people to act compassionately to everyone, and that includes a veterinarian. And appreciate that, if your veterinarian comes into the room and is a little short with you, or they sound kind of stressed, or maybe they're not as friendly or sweet as you'd like them to realize that, maybe they just came out of a 4-hour surgery where they saved an animal's life by performing medical miracles. Maybe they just came out of a room where they just spent 15 minutes counseling a family of 5 who just said goodbye to their dog. You don't know. But chances are, if your veterinarian is short with you, it's not because they're a mean person who's after your money. It's probably because they're dealing with some really heavy shit that you are just lucky to never have to deal with yourself. When I worked in emergency medicine, there'd be days when I would go from one euthanasia to the other. I think one night I probably put down 7 animals in a row within the space of like an hour and a half. And then I had to go into a room where there was a couple of kittens who had wax in their ears or something stupid like that. And I literally just put down 7 dogs, dealt with 7 grieving families in a row. This is me like my first year at a vet school. I think I was like 27 or something. And then I walk into a room with people are like, oh, my cute little kitten, don't you just love him? He's got wax in his ears. And having, those people never knew that I just spent an hour and a half dealing with death and grief. And unfortunately, that is not an uncommon experience in the veterinary profession. And that's a heavy psychological burden. That is a lot to deal with. And people don't see it because veterinarians are professionals. We just keep it on the inside. We don't let it show. We're just there saying, yes, you have an adorable kitten. Yay, I'm so happy you came here. Let me show you a great deal of compassion and concern for your inane, tiny problem, which is fantastic. And that's the ideal scenario. But if I failed to have been that excited about seeing kittens in that scenario, in a rational, reasonable world, it would be okay. In the real world, it probably would have resulted in a client who thinks I'm the worst vet in the world who's just in it for the money. So feel compassion for your vets. Be nice to them. Take care of your pets. Treat everybody with respect. And just remember, being a vet's a tough gig. And veterinarians do it for the animals. There's no other good reason or argument to do this. It's a silly, silly thing to do with your life. And every single one of us could be doing something that is much easier and more profitable with the grades that we had to get into vet school. But we choose to do this really, really difficult, stressful, exhausting, underpaid, ridiculous job for the animals. So this is what it's all about. So thank you very much for listening to me and for watching this video, and hope you all have a great day.